We do have a quorum, but I think we should wait because I'm quite sure Gabriel's planning on attending. Here, he just showed up.
Mary, this is Mallory. I don't know if you were on, but
I got the message that Trisha Dana be 30 minutes late.
Yep.
Trisha. Oh, Sarah. Is Sarah on yet? Has anybody heard from her?
She's not on yet.
I know she's not on. Has anybody heard that she might not be?
I haven't heard.
Well, it's only 1 minute after. It's only 1 minute after. I'm not going to worry. I might text her. Are you attending the workshop at 2? Is my volume and voice sounding okay?
Yep, you're coming through loud and clear.
Okay, good. I had computer problems. My computer crashed on Sunday. It was tragic. Yes, she says yes, she's attending, so we'll give her another minute. I like the handouts, Mila. They were really, I liked what you gave us.
Great.
It'd be nice to even, for follow-up to look at and see. Is it recording yet? It looks like it's blinking.
it is recording and live on YouTube. Sorry.
Well, I'm going to open the meeting. I'm going to open this meeting of the Grand County Commission. It's a workshop on land use. In attendance are Mila Irwin, Jacques Hadler, Kevin Walker, Evan Clapper, Gabriel Wojtek, Mallory, and as staff, and Chris Baird, our county administrators. Is Quinn on? Is Quinn attending? Do you know?
Quinn was on earlier, so I'm guessing he maybe is having a connection issue, but we'll be back on.
Okay. I will announce, well, we should probably wait for him. Well, I guess he can listen to the recording. Maybe people are having tech problems getting on. Sarah message. Is there a link? Could you resend her the link? Mallory?
Yes, I'll do that right now.
Mallory's sending it right now.
Okay, Mary, I sent it, and Quinn sent an email that his computer froze, so he's restarting it and should be on in just a moment.
Must be time for technology problems. How was your vacation, Jacques?
Oh, it was great, Mary. Thank you. Yeah, just got back on Sunday evening. So
Oh,
fresh,
and yeah.
fresh back in the car.
Thank you for participating from such a long distance.
Yeah, it actually worked out great. I found a nice spot to hole up in, and the internet connection was excellent.
Yeah. Oh, Sarah's and Quinn are both on. Sarah Stock, Commissioner, and Quinn Hall, Clerk Auditor. So I will hand this meeting over to Mila Irwin to conduct the workshop. Go ahead, Mila.
Thanks, Mary. All right, so I am going to just go ahead and share my screen. Let's see. Can you all see that? All right, and then I wonder if there we go. All right. So I put together this presentation for, mostly for the new commissioners. I think some of the commissioners that have been there for a little while will probably find some of this to be fairly basic. So I apologize for that, but I do hope to allow for questions at the end. If anyone has any, I'll do my best to answer to the extent of my knowledge. I think, land use in general and land use in Utah is always a process that's a little bit in flux. There's often many new land use related bills that are introduced in every legislative session. So some of the rules do tend to change. There's currently a lot of discussion regarding ADUs in this legislative session, for instance. So we're constantly updating our understanding of state code, and then working on our Grand County land use code updates as well. Sometimes to support policies, oh gosh, I'm sorry, that the commission is putting forward, and then sometimes to match state law. So with that background, know that this is not a static permanent kind of a thing, but in general, I wanted to give everybody kind of an introduction to first what the purpose of the Utah Land Use Development and Management Act. So this is a really good thing to keep in mind as we are all working on policy here in Grand County. This is what the state provides as the purposes of a general land use authority. So these are kind of the underpinnings of having a land use code at all, which is in and of itself a policy decision. So these, I don't want to read them off, but in general, you're protecting the health, safety, welfare, and quality of life for the people in your municipality. I will note that item K here, protect property values, is also a part of Utah's code. The purposes, again, so this is what you're allowed to do and what you're allowed to affect. So these are all of the things that the county commission has the authority to write all these things: ordinances, resolutions, rules, restrictive covenants, easements, and development agreements governing all of these items. So if in the future, you can always Google this as purposes of Utah LUDMA, or refer back here if you ever have a question about whether or not it's something that you might be allowed to do. The Utah Ombudsman Office is also a really great resource for some of these more procedural questions. And we can talk about that later a little bit too. So in our office, these are currently in Grand County, the types of permits that require planning and zoning review. So these are the general permits that we get in our office that have some zoning component that is that's part of that evaluation. So the use table in the code, that's section 3. Business licenses all need to comply with the use that's in that spot, that's in that zone. And then we're also reviewing for use specific standards. You'll find those at the end of that section 3 underneath the use table. And these are things that the commission has been working on recently regarding the resort special zone use table. And then if we do end up talking about like OHV and ATV regulations, we'll be looking at probably those use specific standards. So these are the types of things that our office is reviewing for zoning compliance. Building permits. So this is just any structure that's going up. This doesn't have to do with land use changes as far as property lines and subdivisions and things like that. But we do review all building permits, and the commission has set the setbacks, for instance, and the densities in the various zones. So that's where those come into compliance. Outdoor lighting as well, with our dark sky lighting code that was passed, I believe, 2 years ago. That's where we're also reviewing for compliance with that. And then as well, I don't know if it ended up coming before the commission, but there are things such as 20 units on a dead-end street. So we're looking at, when does that get tipped if we have a dead-end street or a cul-de-sac or something like that. So, and then ADUs as well. So building permits come to us for review. And then there's planning permits, which is mostly what we're going to be looking at through the rest of this workshop. And those are these kind of larger land use decisions that are not to do with the specifics, such as a building permit or a business license. So subdivisions, rezones, the overnight accommodations overlay, any of those overlays, any change generally in the use, the general use of the property or the configuration of the property is contained within that planning permits category. And these are the ones that come before the county commission. So you generally don't see the business licenses and the building permits, but because those are more of a procedural issue. But you do see a lot of these planning permits. Special events as well, and the commission is involved in that. Any special event does also need to comply with those, with the use table also, even if it is just for a short period of time. So these are all the things that we review. The first two just come to our office, but the commission does make lots of decisions that affect those regulations. And then the planning permits and special events you do see in your meetings. So that's a quick background of those, all the different types of permits. Then we have the administrative versus legislative decisions, and I'm sure that you're well familiar with this, but we do write it into our staff report. So I just wanted to review it real quick. Administrative decisions are ones in which you don't have any discretion. So if it does comply with all the provisions in the code, it must be approved. And these are generally approved via resolutions. Legislative decisions are those related to policy. And so that's all of the rezones, the overlays, the decisions that are more discretionary. They're considered that you're taking the good of the general population into account. So that's the basic difference between those two. And so, when we do institute a new overlay, or we do have, a rezone or something like that, where you're allowed to take into consideration a larger a larger decision-making, a larger set of things that you're making decisions about, then those are legislative decisions. And I know you've talked with Christina a little bit about that, but they cannot be capricious and arbitrary. Those are the two words to keep in mind for those legislative decisions. And that's why I know she's asked you in the past to explain your vote and what is going on behind it. So there is discretion, but there isn't just, randomness, essentially. You still do have to give somebody a good reason for the decisions that you're making for those legislative decisions. So,
on that, Mila,
yes.
can I ask a question really quick? Or maybe make a comment. I also think it's imperative to that being the case that if we recuse ourselves from voting, to me, we should explain why we are doing so. You can't, in my mind, we can't just recuse ourselves because we're uncomfortable. We don't want to vote.
Yeah, and I think Christina usually has some good advice for that. I know that she has preferences as far as how commissioners should or shouldn't, participate in voting, and if there needs to be a reason or not. And so I think she's done some good outlining of those guidelines.
Is Chris Baird listening? He probably has the answer to that. He's our Robert's Rules guru.
Sorry, I was on the phone with somebody else. Say that again.
Ask the question again, Trish.
I don't know if it was a question or a comment, but yeah, I wanted to discuss just recusal from voting. So Mila was just saying that in the case of, legislative voting, that we explain our votes just to make sure that it's not, just a personal kind of comment. But to me, recusal from voting should also be explained to the public why we're doing so.
Is that
But
required?
I guess that's not.
Well, explaining your vote's not required, period. And so in some cases, recusing explaining your vote can help strengthen any defensiveness, but there's no instance where explaining your vote is required.
Yeah,
Trish, did you mean
recommended,
recusing or also abstaining?
Yes, Kevin, I didn't hear you.
Sorry, I was asking Trish whether she meant recusal specifically.
Yes, I'm sorry. Yeah. Yes, that is correct.
So, no, I would say that you don't have to. You can if you want, and sometimes it might be to some advantage to explain your vote, but there's no requirement in our policies of the governing body that anybody explain their vote.
Right. So I think Trisha's was just asking if she needed to, if there's a reason that you would need to explain why you weren't voting.
Yeah.
Why you were abstaining.
Yeah.
I think that
right.
just depends on circumstances, and I don't know if I can answer that question broadly. I think that there could be circumstances where you'd want to, but I don't know exactly what those might be. In general, people explain their vote just to avoid further questions or getting, hounded with questions later afterward about why they voted the way they did. But for recusal, I guess it depends. A lot of the times, when we explain our vote, especially in land use code situations, it's to enforce or bolster our ability to defend the action at some point later in time.
Yeah.
And so, if you don't agree with the majority and you're recusing yourself, maybe that doesn't apply because you're not in favor of the end result, perhaps. I don't know. And you don't want to try to, bolster it. I don't know. The circumstances are too broad for that scenario, though. It's hard for me to answer that question generally.
Yeah, and I think Christina does a good job of giving advice based on the particulars of a situation as well. So you can always ask her about that.
I have another question.
Are you
During
still there? Okay, sorry, I had to.
there have been times with these legislative decisions where the topic of public clamor has come up.
Mhm.
Where does that play in terms of how it's written and sort of how
Yeah.
we're meant to consider?
We did have to. I mean, we
So
kind of have to get it
I would
big
say
for all
that
of
that's a very good
Good, good.
question for Christina.
also, but it is just for the.
I don't want to give a definitive answer on that.
Chris Barrett, I think you need to mute yourself.
Oh yeah, there we go. I think it's a fine line, and I don't know exactly what the legal definition is between public comment and public clamor. So I would punt that over to her and let her weigh in on that one.
But my understanding from past cases where this has come up is on administrative decisions. I think there are court cases where the judge criticized, Moab City, for example, for paying attention to public clamor when it should have just been an administrative decision.
Mhm.
But I think on the legislative decisions, on the other hand, then we have a much lower bar that we have to clear, and it's fine to listen to, quote, public clamor then. So I think that the status of public clamor depends on whether it's an administrative or legislative decision. Does that sound right to you, Mila?
I'm not positive. Definitely, administrative decisions shouldn't have public input necessarily. People can have opinions, obviously, and conversation, of course. But as I said, if it complies with all provisions in the code, the commission doesn't really have a choice. They would be, they don't have that discretion. So, if there's something that doesn't comply with the code and that's what's being appealed or argued, then that's a different story. Whereas legislative decisions, the commission actually has an obligation to offer an opportunity for public comment and to listen to that. And I think Christina has mentioned public clamor in the past in relation to legislative decisions. And I'm not sure about the distinction between clamor and comment in that case. So I think that would be a good question for her if there was a distinction between those two. I think that what's at stake there is that the commission has an obligation to govern in the best way that they see fit for the general population, and not necessarily to just listen to the people that call in with public comment. For instance, you're still obligated to make a decision that you think is best for everyone. And so I think that maybe that's the difference between the clamor and the comment. So, but we'd need to ask Christina for that for sure. So I'm going to move on. The guidance for legislative decisions, and these is often contained in staff reports, or it should be contained in all of our staff reports. You can look in two places, and these are for legislative decisions, of course. There's a purpose section in the beginning of the special purpose and overlay districts, which is where most of our legislative decisions are contained, except for rezones. The purpose gives you the general guidelines for how that section was envisioned to work. These are various. There's usually 4 to 8 criteria there. It gives the reason and the underpinnings behind that particular section or that particular ordinance. And then in sections in Article 9, which is administration and procedures, outlines these specific issues for consideration. And that guides the Planning Commission and the County Commission, whoever it is that needs to decide as to what exactly the questions are that you should be considering when you are making that decision. So in thinking about a particular application, usually it would be a combination of looking at the purpose, the general purpose, and then also the specific issues for consideration that were written out for that particular process. And these are contained in staff reports, and then you can also reference them on your own if you'd like to. So Most of the land use applications that we are currently getting, and this is by no means, you know, a statistically valid summary, but this is generally what we're seeing in our office in the past year or so. Lots of subdivisions, those are administrative decisions for the most part. General rezone, that's just, you know, one zone to another zone. A planned unit development, which you've all just seen one recently of those. High density housing overlay, overnight accommodations overlay. We get some conditional use permits, although those are a little bit less common right now. And then we have a lot of site plan reviews. So I included that last one just because it is a very common application that we're getting, although it does not come to the county commission. So site plan, I'm going to go over the other ones in detail, but we won't really go over site plans too much. They are, you know, anything that's permitted by right in a zone. So any use that's permitted by right, but that does need site plan review, so engineering review or you know, building, planning and zoning, they go before the development review team and then get approved administratively. So there's no large land use decisions involved in a site plan review. It's already a permitted use and it just needs to be compliant. So first of all, subdivisions, these are fairly straightforward. We do have a final plat on the agenda for today. So this is coming up right now. You're probably all really familiar with this. I'll just be quick. New dividing land into new legal parcels. That's a plat or previously subdivided land. So something that was already part of a subdivision, that's a replat. You may see a notice for a replat. So that's one slightly different thing about a replat versus a regular subdivision. We are required to do public notice just for the meeting. So you are not required to have a public hearing where the public is allowed to have comment or must be allowed to provide comment. You just have to have notice for a public meeting for the replat. So if you do run into that, it is kind of a distinction there that can be a little bit confusing. And our office takes care of that notice. Minor record surveys, you'll also see those on agendas sometimes. Sometimes they end up on the consent agenda. These are just 3 lots or less, residential use only, everything's already available, and it can only be the first time that it's subdivided. And these are also, I believe now they're referred to as minor subdivisions in state code, so we may change the name of that. Preliminary plats go before the Planning Commission. They are the deciding authority on preliminary plats. So the County Commission used to also see preliminary plats. They no longer do. Those just start and end at Planning Commission, and then the County Commission only sees final plats. So all of these, any final plat that you end up seeing on your agenda, the Planning Commission has already looked at it and approved the preliminary plat. And all of these are reviewed by our development review team as well. So all the county agencies involved, and then most of the utility companies also. So that's the general gist of subdivisions. And you can see that I've referenced the Article 7 has the subdivision standards, and then Section 9, all those Section 9s are the administrative procedures. So general rezone, this is another one we see pretty frequently. This is a legislative decision. Parcel or parcels, it doesn't matter, you can have multiple, to a different zone from another zone. That's it, just rezone. 9.2.7 has the issues for consideration. There's a set of questions in there. Again, these are not required. There are no required answers for any of them, but they're just, you know, guidance for the County Commission in making their decision. There are 2 public hearings required, one at Planning Commission, and after which they make a recommendation, and then a public hearing at County Commission, and then the County Commission has the final decision. The one thing that we are always supposed to keep in mind with rezones is that spot zoning is generally not considered to be best practices. That's, and I define that later on in our definitions, but that is a, you know, kind of arbitrary zone, one parcel zoned to advantage or detriment in relation to the ones around it. So that's one thing that we try to keep in mind with rezones, and otherwise it is a legislative decision. Up to you. PUDs, so we've seen these recently, planned unit development. The purpose is to allow for cluster development. They provide an opportunity to change dimensional standards and lot configuration patterns of the underlying zone to allow for a different layout to facilitate creative site planning. This is a tool that the county has used quite a few times already. Arroyo Crossing is probably the most current large PUD that everybody's most likely familiar with. This is the tool that allowed Arroyo Crossing to develop with small lots to promote affordability in their case, and then leave another chunk as undeveloped space. So they're concentrating their density. That's what cluster development is. And then leaving the rest of it as undeveloped. You can see the commentary. These are taken directly out of our land use code. The general plan encourages a cluster development pattern with development located in the most appropriate part of the property. Small clusters of 5 to 10 dwellings, each separated by common area or open space, tends to be most effective in preserving rural character. And we will be updating our general plan coming up here soon. So that is an opportunity to revisit some of these reasons and land use code tools if the commission sees fit to do so.
Do you know, prior to that, and this is just a recommendation, I really we're not like, I understand we're not, I know you're just giving a presentation, but I'm just kind of throwing this out to the commission in general. I really think before we get into that, it's imperative to do a general survey of specifically Spanish Valley residents as to what they prefer as to development, because this, go ahead.
Trish, you're I don't know if it's for everybody, but you're cutting out a lot. So if you turn off your video, you probably, your audio should work better.
Okay, thank you, Mary. So I want to throw that we do a survey before we get back into the general plan, because this idea that cluster development is a preference to retain rural character, I think you would find that that's not what the members, the community members of Spanish Valley would consider preserving rural character. So I do want, just throwing that out, I really think it's imperative we start engaging our community members and their preferences as we move forward, specifically with planning and zoning.
Yeah, thanks, Tricia. And the general plan update will absolutely contain a specific public engagement component. So that's something that's part of the scope of work for our request for proposals for sure. So this is a good example of a planning tool that requires, or a land use process that requires a master plan. So really quick, a master plan is the general idea, and it's not final engineering of what the development is going to look like. So a lot of our legislative approvals now require a master plan. That was not true in the past. And those do get recorded along with the approving ordinance. So essentially the commission, if they're approving one of these applications, so that'd be a planned unit development, a high density housing overlay, an overnight accommodations overlay, they're approving not only applying that designation to that property. So for instance, the high density housing overlay, but they're also approving the specific layout that the applicant has proposed. So that approval is not a blanket approval to do, whatever you want on that property that's allowed. It's only for that master plan. And there are guidelines in the land use code that govern whether or not an amendment would be a major amendment or a minor amendment. And minor amendments are, things like moving a road to accommodate some engineering concern that came up at preliminary or final plat, slightly over, or, slightly adjusting lot lines, adding easements, things like that would be minor amendments, and that wouldn't come back before you. But major amendments to a master plan would have to be reapproved by county commission. So when you are approving one of these legislative overlays that includes a master plan, it's only for that master plan. So that means that the public hearings happen at Planning Commission and County Commission. And that's for the approving ordinance with the overlay or the plan unit development and the master plan. Those get recorded. And then the applicant will come back to the planning commission and the county commission with their preliminary plat and their final plat if they're doing a subdivision as part of this overlay. So it's kind of a two-step process for a lot of these legislative decisions that require a lot of public hearings and public input. And the master plans end up being are part of public record as well, so you can always go back and look at them. So high density housing overlay, and this is something that I think we're going to talk about at some point coming up here soon as well with our new rules and regulations document that we're working on. The ordinance was approved in 2019. I'm sure everybody's familiar with it. We are around 284 units approved. That's an approximate number because some of them are in between planning commission and county commission. So there's applications that are in, but they're not actually approved yet. They're just in the pipeline. So we're just about at the end. They all require master plans, 80% deed restriction for locally employed households. And then there are 4 project names there that you may be familiar with. Peakview is currently under construction on Spanish Valley Drive. Murphy Flats is very close to final plat. So is Viewgate Terrace, that's behind the Wingate Hotel. And then the Hawk subdivision and the Starbucks subdivision was the first one. And those have all gone to final plat. So there's the overlay boundaries, this map here. The label is a little confusing. This is straight out of the land use code. This is actually the high density housing overlay eligibility district boundaries. So these are the different density numbers that a parcel in that eligibility district would be allowed to apply for. And they are not allowed to apply for any more density than the eligibility district provides. So, so a lot of Spanish Valley is not included in the high density housing overlay eligibility districts. And so they would not be eligible to apply for that overlay. And this similarly goes through the public hearing process to the master plan and then a preliminary plat and a final plat. Go ahead, Tisha.
Can you elaborate on locally employed households? If you don't mind, what exactly does that mean?
Sure. So it is defined in the land use code, and I don't have the very specific details in front of me, but essentially the owners and residents need to earn, I believe it's 75% or more of their income from businesses in Grand County. And then
Okay, for any period of time or is
yes, they can, you can just move here and have a local job, and as long as you prove that currently your income is coming from Grand County, then you would qualify. And we do have provisions for retirees. They need to have had income from Grand County for the last 5 years before they retire. And then we also, I believe, have provisions for caregivers or people that become disabled. It would be a similar kind of qualification.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I have a question as well. I think we got an email this week. I believe it was the Murphy Flats, where they were questioning the ability to have someone from out of town own it, but someone in town renting it. And that is not allowed in our legislation for the high density overlay. Is that correct? Or is that a gray area?
So we are developing the rules and regulations document, which I think will probably come before the council on February 16th at the next meeting. And we'll address all of those specifics during that meeting. The staff and attorney position right now is that it is intended to be ownership and residence. So renters are allowed, but the owners must be locally employed.
So real quick, in this, is there any provision for someone So my partner, for instance, does translations, and he's not paid by somebody in the county. He could never qualify for one of these, even though if he's been a resident of the county for the past 10 years.
Yeah, so it's 50% of the household has to be locally employed.
Okay.
So that's to allow for one partner to be to be employed outside Grand County, as long as one person is locally employed.
So back to my question. So that's the gray area right now as far as it, and now the rules are being tightened up or completed.
No, it's not a gray area. We're just writing the rules and regulations so that it's clearer for everybody to understand. So we'll release that. We are working on that draft, and hopefully that will be sent around and then come out on the meeting on the 16th. So it's not changing anything about what the ordinance says. It's just clarifying some of the language. Okay. So next we have our overnight accommodations overlay, another legislative zoning decision. This one, I don't believe that we've actually taken any applications through this process yet, all the way to the finish line. It's relatively new, so that's not surprising. We have, so when this ordinance was adopted, which was in July of 2019, I believe, or maybe a little bit after that, the map was adopted in July of 2019. The overlay was pre-applied to properties that had been already operating as legal overnight rental businesses prior to the adoption of this overlay, so that they could continue and be compliant with the code. The new overlay includes a set of much stronger development standards related to energy efficiency, water use, xeriscaping, as well as some design standards such as like breaking up the facade of buildings and adjusting varying roof pitches and things like that. The bed and breakfasts were not included in the pre-application of the overnight accommodations overlay. I think that's most of what we have for history. There's a lot more history on the overnight accommodations in general in Grand County, but this is where it stands now. So essentially, any new overnight rental developments have to be permitted via this overlay. It's not a use by right in any zone. And it does require a master plan and legislative approval. And then our office is reviewing it for compliance with development standards that are in there in section 4.6. And then it goes through that public hearing process with a planning commission recommendation and a county commission decision, where you would be approving the ordinance that's applying the overlay to the property and the master plan that shows what the development is going to be. And then after that, this is an example of where if the accommodations development was not going to involve any kind of subdivision or condos or anything like that, then it would just go to a site plan review, which would not come back before either commission. So once that overlay was applied and the master plan was recorded, then that site plan review would just go through the administrative approval process after that. Are there any questions on that one? Okay. And this is for campgrounds, hotels, motels, and then any other, townhouses or overnight rentals like that. Conditional use permits. These are a little bit tricky. That's why I put them up there as administrative/legislative. They allow the county to impose conditions on a particular type of use on a parcel, and you can see in the use table they are noted with C's. So P's are permitted, C is conditional, and then blank means it's not allowed. However, they shall be approved with a finding of no significant negative impact. So generally, if somebody has complied with the conditions in the conditional use, listed, then they will be granted their permit, and it is fairly difficult to turn one down as long as those conditions are met.
Neil, in the second bullet, where is that quoting from?
That's a great question. I believe I took that out of the either LUDMA or our code. I believe it's in both.
Okay.
And so this is true across the state of Utah. So conditional uses are governed by LUDMA as well. We haven't seen too many of these applications of late. I know the Planning Commission was doing a lot of work to try and tighten up which uses in the table they wanted to actually stay as conditional uses versus just permitting or not allowing them, or permitting them with use specific standards. So we haven't seen a ton, but we do have some. It does allow the county to impose conditions, which can be helpful if there's a unique situation where the county feels that to mitigate any potential negative impact, then they would like to add a particular condition to that conditional use permit. So that's where it can be useful.
From what I understood when we had the person from the Omnibus, is that what it's called?
The ombudsman.
Yeah, they came and gave a workshop. It was really good. And he said this is one area where, see if I remember right, a conditional use permit, they have to meet the conditions.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where the public clamor comes in, because if they meet the conditions required, just because people don't like the idea of it happening, we can't take that into account.
Right.
We can only take into account if they have met the conditions, and that's why it's called a conditional use. If they've met the requirements of the conditional use, even if you have hundreds of people telling you, we don't want it, we don't like it, because we're just saying, yes, you met the conditions. Am I correct?
Yes, that's exactly right. Yeah, so it is sort of a administrative decision hiding underneath a legislative cloak, because you do have to approve it if they do meet the conditions.
So yeah, and just to clarify, it's not legislative at all. It's strictly administrative.
Right. It goes through the public hearing process, I guess, which is why it sort of seems like it's discretionary, even though it's not.
Before 2008, there was a lot more discretion built into LUDMA for conditional uses, but after 2008, a Senate bill changed it significantly so that, and made it a use by right, essentially, with conditions.
Yeah. Which is why I think the public hearing part of the conditional use permit can be confusing for a lot of people, because it does still require public hearings. But just as you're saying, Mary, you can't really take into account whether or not people like it. It really only matters if they're meeting the conditions. So that one can be a little bit confusing. But they're generally, I think that generally the conditions are fairly reasonable. And this is one thing that the land use code can address well, and that the commission can weigh in on. If you do see a use and the conditions that seem like that they don't match, or that you'd like them to be different, then this is where we can adjust the land use code to make sure that they match something that the commission would like to see. And then we have the site plan review. So like we were saying, this is where a lot of the overnight accommodations developments would come back to us for their final review. Building permits, business licenses, the employee housing exception, which you may have heard about. There are 5 RV sites allowed in our code on the property of a business with a site plan review. So they have to have full water and sewer hookups, and a flat pad, The square footage, I believe, of the site needs to be 800 square feet for the RV site, and they have to have a parking space. So that is the employee housing exception. It's under an accessory use, and we're actually reviewing one of those applications tomorrow. The largest caveat to that is that it does need to happen on the site that the business is registered. So it can't be an off-site employee housing use. And then any other development that's not regulated under other categories, but that does require DRT review comes to us for those. Then just a few important terms. I know we've talked about a few of these, and I'm sure that there's many more. Open space. I know that it's a hard one because the sort of like literal use of open space is space that is open. However, it does have a legal definition, and it is actually considered permanently dedicated land to be used in common by the residents of the development and or the public, subject to section 6.11. You can go ahead and read 6.11 if you'd like to. So when we do refer in particular to things like PUDs, also the overnight accommodations overlay has an open space requirement. PUDs do not have an open space requirement. What they do end up with is a cluster development and then a larger lot. And that larger lot is another lot. It's just another private parcel. They have the option of dedicating open space. And there is the option for the commission to grant a discretionary density bonus if a landowner would like to do that. But it is not a requirement. And so I think it's good for all of us to be conscientious about the way that we use that word open space, because it does mean actually dedicated land that's used in common either by the residents just of that development or by the public.
So do you have a suggestion for space that's not public, that just happens to be open?
What was that?
That's come up recently. I guess in both the Strawberg and in the Creekside, part of the debate was, there was going to be, because of clustering, more space between buildings, but it wasn't open space in the sense of being dedicated in this sense. So I was asking, what do you think we should call it then so that we understand each other when we're talking about it?
That's a good question. I think we can refer to it as, smaller lots and a larger lot. That's what I would, that's literally what's happening. So I think that's really how we should be talking about it, is that we'll have a larger lot.
But if someone wants to say, they might say carelessly, I like having the larger lot because it allows for more open space around. And so how would you fix that sentence?
I think we need to be a lot more careful with that. You can say, something like preserves views or allows for, less density on that larger lot, bigger setbacks, something along those lines. I think we just need to be careful to avoid open space. And I think it is a little bit awkward because it is a literal definition of open space. But in the land use context, it really is a legal term, and we can't use it when it's not appropriate.
But it's a
go ahead, Kevin.
Okay, just one legal term defined in our code, or is this something? Because we could just change the definition of our code and fix. To me, it seems like just open space should refer to anything open, and we should say dedicated open space or public open space when we need this. I think that would be.
We could, and I don't know the specific answer to that question. I know that it is defined in our code, and it is a commonly defined term used this way in other municipalities as well.
Yeah, and Mila, I really, really, really appreciate you not only defining this for us, but also kind of, touching on the idea like we have to be very careful, because I do believe with both of those PUDs, there was an understanding by multiple commissioners, let's say, that there was dedicated open space. And it's like, no, that wasn't open space. And I think that's why those communities were so upset. One of the many reasons they were upset, but I think that was one of them, that, there was this misconception that those developers are leaving it as such, as some kind of, great thing for the community. And it's like, no, not so much. And so I really appreciate you just kind of reiterating this for us and making sure that people are using that verbiage appropriately.
Sure. And it is a tough one. I mean, I've done it too. It's definitely hard. I agree, Kevin, to be able to find the terminology to refer to that larger lot, while acknowledging that it isn't going to be, or it wouldn't support as much development in the same amount of space as the smaller lots, but it is not actually open space. So, I think we'll all just have to be a little bit creative with our language there. But the larger lot is really what it is. So then a deed restriction, I'm sure you're all familiar with this, but just to reiterate, because it does come up, especially with the HDHO. These are just conditions, any conditions placed on the deed to a property that set out restrictions or rules for its use. So we are requiring a deed restriction with the high density housing overlay properties. And that specifies that they must be for that local ownership or locally employed households. And the specific language for that deed restriction is contained in the land use code. But this is a tool that the county commission can use, and some developers have offered to, if they offer affordable housing and the commission wants to, for instance, grant a density bonus for an affordable housing component to a project, then you would be requiring a deed restriction on that affordable housing that would guarantee its affordability into the future. So that's what you would use that tool for. Cluster development, as we talked about with the PUDs, this is defined in our code as a development design technique that concentrates buildings in specific areas on a site to allow the remaining land to be used for recreation, open space, and agricultural uses. And so this is very confusing, whereas, it's not a requirement. And our code defines it in this way, and this is lifted directly out of the Grand County Land Use Code. And so, I think Trisha's point, is a good one, in that, we do have some of these things in our code where, the definition may not match exactly the intention of the rest of the code. And that's something that the commission just worked on, I think, 2 meetings ago when we better defined what we meant by camping, for instance. So these are some of the things that that staff will bring before you when we recognize that we have some of these language issues in our code that we need to fix.
No, I appreciate, again, Mila, I appreciate that. I do think there are things that we need to clean up. And another one is, and just throwing this out, is what we deem as agricultural. Like, I do think that if people are able to use that terminology, there should be some teeth behind it. To me, agriculture means it's in cultivation. You have water rights to support that cultivation. So I'm just throwing, and maybe all of that exists, and I just haven't taken the time to delve into it. But I do want to throw that out, that I think if we're going to allow developers to use that terminology, it should be supported by some teeth.
Yeah, and we do have agricultural use defined in our code as well. That's also in section 10 in the definitions. And it is also, you can get a tax designation for Greenbelt, which is an agricultural designation. But yes, there are certainly situations where you do the best that you can, and then there ends up being situations that you kind of have to address afterwards and see what happens with the technique that you've chosen. Spot zoning I included in here just as part of the general rezone. You'll hear us use that term in applications. And that is where a particular small tract within a large district is specifically zoned so as to impose upon it restrictions not imposed upon the surrounding lands, or grant to it special privileges not granted generally, which is also not done in pursuance of any general or comprehensive plan. And so we are generally trying to avoid spot zoning when we're talking about a rezone application. I think that was the important terms that I chose out of our definitions for now. And we can talk about some other ones if anybody has any specific questions. The last slide here just has a few resources. Obviously, there's many more, but just it was a place to start. LUDMA is that Utah code. That's the link directly to it. It's Title 10. That's what really governs what we legally are allowed to do in with our land use code. And we do try to keep our land use code updated to correspond to the changes that happen at the state level.
So Mila, since we're a county and not a municipality, shouldn't that be Title 17, 27A instead of 10.9A?
I may have grabbed the wrong link there. I'm not sure.
I mean, they're almost identical, but I think there are a few
Yeah,
differences.
there are some different rules for a county versus a municipality. Yeah, I'll check on that link and make sure that I grab the right one.
Title 17 is always county code, and so Kevin's reference is the correct one.
All right, sorry about that. I'll send out the right link after this. I just put that one together real quick. The Utah Land Use Academy has a lot of great resources. They have a lot of videos, training videos on all kinds of things, from planning commission, kind of process to what some of these land use tools are. They also have a lot of print resources. So that's a great website to go try and dig around in. And then the Grand County Land Use Code, of course. And it's not always the easiest thing to read, but once you get used to digging around in the section guides to the left, then it's generally get where you try to go. So, and thanks for that, Kevin. I'll definitely send out the right link to that. Sorry about that. All right, that's all I have for the formal part of the presentation. And then does anybody have any questions? I know we've already answered some.
Questions?
I have a few small questions. So you, and some of these, maybe we should just discuss later, but at the very beginning, you mentioned cul-de-sacs and that 20. So is there, is it, I mean, I tried looking through our code and it wasn't clear to me what counts, like is, for example, Kayenta Heights, is that a cul-de-sac? There's only one entrance and exit, but there's kind of a complicated road network behind it.
Yeah, so that's one that's part of our construction standards, and it stems from an emergency management perspective. So it's based on people being able to get out in an emergency, and the way that I believe we have interpreted it is the end section of a dead end street. So not from the very beginning all the way to the end, but each segment where it connects to another road. So if it doesn't connect to any other road, if there's no other way out, then that would be a dead end street.
So for example, so we could have like a long dead end street. So that's clearly a cul-de-sac. Or I could have almost the same long dead end street and it's got a little circle at the end. So there's never, no dead end, but there is still just one entry and one exit for all those houses. Is the second one considered a cul-de-sac?
Well, it depends. I mean, that's one that, we end up discussing in the DRT and try to figure it out. We do have cul-de-sac standards, so you can't actually have a, infinitely long dead end street. Some of these streets in the county were constructed before these standards were in place. So we do have some non-compliant streets. But currently that's in our construction code, and that's something that we're looking for instance, when we approve a new ADU on an existing cul-de-sac.
Okay, but so if it's just kind of one entry and one exit to a development and it's got a loop rather than just a classical dead end, cul-de-sac or not cul-de-sac?
I don't know. I would have to ask Brandon at the fire department and Bill Jackson about that, our road supervisor.
Okay, thanks. Next question. There was some talk in the past, I guess we've got a lot of the stuff that the building inspector people do is enforcing just the building code. And I think in the past, they have been resistant to doing things like our dark night skies, lighting inspections and things like that. What's the status of getting a more getting some flexibility from our building inspectors so that they can check for other things as long as they're on the site. Is that ongoing?
Yeah, no, it's great. We actually, over the summer, we worked out a new arrangement with them where they are going to be doing those inspections for us. So we're cooperating really closely with the building department now. We have weekly meetings and we're working together on all of those kinds of inspections. They are doing our dark skies inspections for us right now, as well as our parking and setbacks. So we're all reviewing permits before they go out to inspection, and then making sure that we list all the things that our department would need them to check. And then they're looking at those things for us. So we're cooperating closely with them now.
Okay, great. I'm glad to hear that. Next question is about 721 of our land use code. And it says in part, this is governing subdivisions, the lot size, width and depth, in addition, shall be appropriate for the location in the subdivision, which makes me wonder whether when we're approving or not a subdivision, whether we can just, even if they satisfy all the setback standards and usual things, we say, yeah, it doesn't seem appropriate to us. And that would just be some safety valve if it's something that maybe meets the letter of the remainder of the ordinance, but just seems like a really bad idea. Does you have a position on whether that section of our land use code gives us extra tools for maybe not approving subdivisions?
So I certainly don't have a strong position on that one. I would need to defer to Christina or look at the state code. But in general, if a subdivision meets the requirements, it does need to be approved. So, it's not a legislative decision. There's no discretion there. I know it sounds a little bit like discretion, but as far as I've seen, there's a lot of leeway in saying that it's an appropriate layout. As long as the engineering is approved and the roads, as long as the DRT has approved it and there are no major, health and safety issues, then as far as I understand it, we don't get to say, I just don't like the way that it looks.
Right, but it is a requirement that's written in our code that it has to be appropriate. And so, that would be meaningless unless there was some way to fail that requirement.
Right, and I don't think that, appropriate has been well defined in any way that we would be able to lean on it for making that a discretionary decision. Okay.
And then my final question, I think I brought this up maybe months ago in the planning commission meeting, but San Juan County, for example, has this very general language about conditional uses that, in addition to whatever other specific things they list, conditional uses should be compatible with the other uses in the zone. They just sort of give them, and I guess it would just provide, a sort of vague but potentially useful tool for approving or not, any conditional use. And I just sort of wonder whether it might make sense in our land use code to have provisions like that, maybe just as a stopgap measure until we tighten up some of the language.
Well, I think in that case, I would think that essentially the compatibility with other uses in the zone would have been decided by the fact that it's included in the land use code in the use table with those other uses in the zone. So I think the fact that it is a conditional use in that zone means that the county commission thought that it was compatible with the other uses in that zone.
Well, I guess for San Juan County, they list all the other uses as conditional, and so they're a little bit weird that way. So that's part of it. But I could imagine some of the we do have these categories in our use table, like all other retail, and who knows what that includes. And if we don't list specific conditions, it's like a gaping hole. But if we were to put in this language, anything else, all other uses, but it has to be compatible, that might give us grounds for turning down a surprising application in the future.
We do have a lot more specificity too in the use specific standards and then also in the use categories. So we have been looking over those, and there's actually quite a lot that's listed there. You'd be surprised. We haven't actually encountered too many things, really hardly any, that don't turn out to actually be addressed in the use table. So it's not just that general category. If you go all the way down to the use categories, they're much more defined. as well.
Point well
But, yeah,
taken. Thanks.
there's always a surprising application.
Trish, didn't you have a question? Was it Trish?
Nope, I'm good.
Okay, I thought I heard
you.
when Kevin was. Okay, good. Anyone else? Thank you, Mila. I think this was very informative. Some of it was review, but a lot of it was, made me think about it in a new way. So thank you.
Sure.
Okay, we have reached the end of this portion, our workshop. So unless I have some objection, we will adjourn and return at 4 o'clock for our regular, well, it'd be the MBA and then our regular meeting. Everyone okay with adjourning? Okay, this workshop is adjourned. Thank you.